The night it happened, the city looked exactly as it always did. Streetlights evenly illuminated the empty roads, bars closed one by one, and police radios transmitted only routine messages. No one suspected that in just a few hours, an ordinary morning report would turn into a case that would later be called one of the most mysterious in the state. At 5:18 a.m., a call came into the station from a woman walking her dog along the river. She spoke calmly, but there was tension in her voice. On the pedestrian path, right next to a bench, lay a man. He wasn't moving. When the police arrived on the scene, it became clear the man was dead. No visible injuries, no blood, no signs of a struggle. He was simply lying there, as if he had sat down to rest and never got back up. Documents identified him as Daniel Morris, 41, a financial consultant, married, 2 children, a man with no criminal past and no conflicts with the law. His wife, Sarah, learned of her husband's death from a police officer who called her at 7 in the morning. She was certain Dan was still at work or on his way home. He often stayed late. The autopsy provided no clear answers. The cause of death was heart failure, but the doctor immediately noted that for a healthy man with no serious issues, it looked strange. No alcohol or drugs were found in his blood. The only alarming thing was traces of a rare drug that wasn't used in cardiology and was almost never used in the United States. Its effect could cause sudden cardiac arrest, but the substance wasn't banned and wasn't considered a poison. The police opened a case. Formally, a suspicious death. Not a murder, not an accident. At least, not yet. The first days of the investigation yielded nothing. Cameras along the river showed Daniel walking alone, talking on the phone, and stopping by the bench. Then, he simply sat down. No one approached him. No one fled. Nothing. But when investigators began to reconstruct the events of the last weeks of his life, the picture began to crack. A month before his death, Daniel's behavior changed. He became more silent, started staying at work even more often, and sometimes didn't spend the night at home, explaining it as urgent client business. Sarah didn't suspect an affair. At least, she didn't say it out loud. She believed her husband was simply exhausted. Daniel's colleagues told a different story. He was often nervous, snapped at subordinates several times, and once said a phrase that would later appear in the case files. "If this comes out, I'm finished." Investigators checked his financial transactions and found something strange. 6 months before his death, Daniel began transferring small sums of money to accounts that didn't belong to his family. The transfers were regular, but not large enough to immediately attract attention. The recipient was a consulting company registered in another state. The company existed only on paper. The address was an abandoned office. The phone went unanswered. The owner was a person with no digital footprint. It looked like a money laundering scheme or a cover-up. But for what exactly? Sarah found out about this during the second interrogation. She was shocked. She knew nothing about any transfers and hadn't seen those sums in the family budget. For the first time, she doubted she really knew her husband. 2 weeks after Daniel's death, police received an email. Unsigned. The email contained only one sentence. He wasn't supposed to die so quickly. The message had been sent from a public library in another city. This changed the status of the case. It officially became a possible murder investigation. Investigators returned to the drug found in his blood. It was used in experimental research related to the treatment of anxiety disorders. The drug was not sold in pharmacies. Only research centers and private laboratories had access to it. One such lab was located 20 miles from the city. Its employees confirmed that a small amount of the substance had gone missing from the lab several months ago. The incident wasn't investigated, it was dismissed as an accounting error. The cameras weren't working that day due to technical maintenance. Among the lab employees was a woman named Laura King, a psychologist by training. She handled administrative work but had access to the materials. Her name had already appeared in the case. It was her personal account that received those consulting transfers from Daniel, masked through the shell company. Laura was brought in for questioning. She appeared calm, too calm. She confirmed she knew Daniel, saying they met at a financial security conference. According to her, he was consulting her on investments. She denied any personal relationship. The money, in her version, was payment for services. But the email correspondence told a different story. There was no romance in the emails, no threats, but there was fear. Daniel wrote that everything has gone too far, that he didn't sign up for these consequences. Laura replied briefly, coldly, sometimes with no emotion at all. In one of the last emails, she wrote, "You can't just walk away." The unexpected twist came when police gained access to an encrypted file on Daniel's laptop. The file contained a list of names, dates, and amounts. These were people, clients of his company, who had lost large sums of money through risky financial schemes. The schemes were legal on paper, but built on manipulation and hidden terms. Daniel had begun gathering evidence. He was preparing to cooperate with federal authorities. Laura found out. According to the investigators' theory, she hadn't planned a murder. She planned control. The drug was supposed to cause a temporary attack, hospitalization, and fear. A signal, stay quiet. But the dosage proved fatal. On the night of his death, they met by the river. The cameras didn't capture the moment of the handoff. Only the fact that Daniel hadn't arrived there by chance. He had received a call minutes before leaving his office. A call from a burner phone.
A year had passed since the sentencing, but for the city, the story was far from over. Formally, the Daniel Morris case was closed. All evidence had been archived, and Laura King's name had vanished from the news cycles. However, among the detectives who worked the case, a sense of incompleteness remained. Too many details failed to fit the final picture. The fatal dosage error theory looked a bit too clean. The doubts began with a trifle. A young analyst, reviewing old materials for an internal audit, noticed a specific detail. The call from a burner phone that lured Daniel out of his office that night had never been definitively identified. It was linked to Laura only indirectly, via cell tower triangulation. But the phone itself was never found. The analyst rechecked the data and discovered something strange. The signal was short and weak, as if the call originated not from the street, but from a moving vehicle. This implied that Laura might not have been alone. This observation triggered a new, unofficial inquiry. No loud statements, no press conferences, just a few detectives who refused to let the case go. They returned to the financial schemes Daniel had compiled in his encrypted file. Now that the primary suspect was behind bars, they gained access to materials previously deemed too sensitive. The deeper they dug, the more obvious it became. Daniel wasn't just a financial consultant who had stumbled. He was a cog in a much larger machine. Among the names in the file, they found not just clients, but partners. People from various states, connected to investment funds, insurance companies, and even one former local politician. The schemes had operated for years, generating profits for those who knew how to exploit them. Daniel was a key node, the man who knew where the money was buried and who was responsible for what. And he had begun to opt out. This changed everything. If previously his death looked like an attempt to silence him, a different motive now emerged, ensuring he would never speak again. Detectives turned their attention to another figure, nearly invisible during the initial investigation. This was Richard Hale, a senior partner at the consulting firm where Daniel worked. Publicly, he had spoken only once, expressing condolences to the family before withdrawing from the spotlight. His alibi for the night of the death was formal, but sufficient to avoid suspicion at the time. Now, It turned out that Richard stood to lose the most if Daniel had turned the materials over to federal authorities. A review of phone records revealed that a few hours before Daniel's death, Richard had made a brief call from the same area where the burner phone signal was later recorded. Formally, it was a coincidence. Factually, it was another crack in the official version. The problem was that Laura King was already serving her sentence. Returning to court without ironclad, new evidence meant risking their careers. But the detectives took a different path. They met Laura in prison. Initially, she refused to talk. She repeated the same lines from the trial. A mistake, fear, a situation spiraling out of control. No, when they showed her the updated flow chart of financial transactions and Richard Hale's name, her demeanor shifted. For the first time, she lost her composure. She didn't confess immediately. She sat in silence for a long time. Then, she uttered the phrase that became the key. "Do you really think I was the one making the decisions?" According to her, the drug was only part of a plan handed to her. She knew she was supposed to scare Daniel, but she didn't see the whole picture. The meeting by the river wasn't her idea. Someone else chose the location. Someone else chose the time. She hadn't seen the car the call came from, but she knew it was there. These statements couldn't be used directly. They were incomplete and lacked physical proof. But they provided a direction. The detectives began to squeeze Richard Hale through other means: tax audits, corporate reviews, and reopening cold cases. 8 months after the first verdict, Richard was arrested, not for murder, but for large-scale financial fraud. This was the catalyst needed for the system to crumble. Former partners began to talk. Minor players agreed to cooperate. Slowly, the true picture emerged. Daniel Morris wasn't supposed to die that night, but he had to be neutralized. His death was a side effect of a struggle for silence. Laura was the instrument. Richard was the coordinator. And the scheme was so vast that no single trial could ever encompass it entirely. 2 years after Daniel's death, the case was officially reclassified. The wording was changed. A new line appeared in the records: murder resulting from a criminal conspiracy. But for the family, it no longer changed a thing. Several more years passed, and the Daniel Morris case had almost vanished from the public eye. It never became a national sensation, never turned into a documentary series, and never earned its own media moniker. In the archives, it was filed as a complex financial conspiracy with lethal consequences. For the system, it was a closed chapter. For certain individuals, it was not. It all returned unexpectedly. The new momentum came from someone who had no connection to the case at all. A young investigative journalist, while working on a piece about financial crimes and private investment funds, stumbled upon a familiar surname. Not Morris, not King. It was another name from the very same list that had once been stored in an encrypted file on Daniel's laptop. This person had never been arrested, never interrogated. They had vanished from sight immediately after Daniel's death, selling their business and moving to another state. Now, the name had resurfaced in an entirely different case, with different victims, but using the exact same mechanics. The journalist didn't know the whole story, but he sensed a familiar pattern. He reached out to a retired detective who had worked the Morris case. At first, the man didn't want to talk, but when he heard the name, he fell into a long silence, then finally said, "We knew it didn't end there." And so, the case began to breathe again, not in the courtrooms, but in the shadows. It turned out that after Richard Hale's arrest, only one link in the chain had broken. The rest of the structure adapted. The people higher up had learned their lessons. They stopped applying direct pressure. They stopped using intermediaries like Laura. They became more cautious, colder. Most importantly, they no longer left witnesses who could talk. Daniel had been a mistake. A man who chose to quit the game instead of disappearing quietly. After him, the system didn't allow for such errors. The former detective reviewed the old files through a new lens. What once seemed like chaos and coincidence now looked like a test. Daniel's death had been a gauge of reaction. How much attention the case would draw. How deep they would dig. Where the limit was. The limit had been defined. That was why, when Laura King tried to file an appeal from prison, it was rejected too quickly. Without a detailed review. Without a new hearing. as if someone didn't want her to be heard ever again. 7 years after Daniel's death, an event occurred regarding Laura that once again caught the attention of a few people. She died in prison. The official cause was sudden complications from a chronic illness. No signs of violence, no suspicious circumstances, but those who remembered her case knew Laura was healthy. Her condition wasn't considered dangerous, and a month before her death, she had requested a meeting with the federal prosecutor who had once overseen the Morris case. The meeting never took place. The journalist included this fact in his report. The article was cautious, devoid of direct accusations. But between the lines, the obvious was clear. The case they thought was finished was merely the tip of the iceberg. After the publication, a person who did not give their name contacted him. This person knew details that weren't in the public record. They knew about the call from the car, about the second phone, about the fact that the Riverside bench wasn't chosen by chance. It was an area with camera blind spots. The caller said only one thing: what happened to Morris isn't an exception. It's the rule. A few weeks later, the journalist received a flash drive. It contained documents, diagrams, and recordings of negotiations. Some files were corrupted, some were intentionally erased. But even what remained was enough to understand the scale. He never published it all. He handed some of the materials over to independent lawyers. Some he kept, because he realized what Daniel Morris had realized in his time. Knowing the truth is dangerous. Know to remain silent is to allow it to repeat. The final paragraph of his article was brief. No names, no conclusions, just an observation. In most criminal stories, the end seems like a finale only to those watching from a distance. In reality, some cases have no conclusion. They simply change shape, and the bench by the river still stands. Sometimes people sit there, looking at the water, never suspecting that this spot was the point where someone once decided silence is worth more than a life.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next thrilling real-life stories.